Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators Program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the Global South, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators Program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm really delighted to share with you this episode. I'm in conversation with the amazing Chhaya Bunty, the founder and CEO of Vetiver and a co-founder of Iora Ecological Solutions. We recently met as co-presenters during the American Industrial Design Association's event focused on life-centered design, and we immediately clicked. So she's based again in India now after a long stint in New York focusing on brand strategy, but she's come home to reimagine, reconnect, reset and focus on work for a regenerative world. She's dedicated to locally accessible projects and communicating the change that we need in the world that is accessible both at a government level, at a corporate level and at a community level, that can help us to accelerate the action that's needed for climate change, for circular economy, for sustainable agriculture and the restoration of biodiversity. It's such a great opportunity for us to have a chance to talk together, and I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation. So welcome to the show, Chhaya. It's an absolute delight to have you here today. For those of you listening, Chhaya and I only met recently, and we were on a show together, run by our friend Bashak Altan, it was called Life-Centered Design, and it was run for the American Institute of Industrial Designers. And so I had a chance to speak, and then afterwards, Chhaya had a chance to speak. And I think my smile was just wrapping up around my ears while I was listening to you speak. And so I reached out to Chhaya and invited her to join me on this show to talk about the kind of work that she's doing in bringing about positive change at local communities to address things like sustainability, to address things like climate change, but focusing on farmers and women. And you've also worked with youth before, I understand, as well. So, and the reach is phenomenal. The amount of people that Chhaya works with is just phenomenal. She's based in India, but it's not just the spread that you have that is remarkable. It's also about how you work in so many different levels simultaneously. So working at a policy level, working at a community level with awareness change, working with farmers and women who are doing work on the ground. So welcome to the show so much. I'm so excited that you've joined me here today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Morag. I would say the same exact thing for you. When Masak was talking to you, I was just filled with so much excitement about what you're doing, and can't wait to have you speak to our communities here as well about your experiences.
Yeah, that'd be great. So maybe we could just start a little bit by, so you're the co-founder and creative director of Vetiver. So maybe we could start there. Maybe you just tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do. Yeah.
Sure. Actually, the founder. So I was just thinking this yesterday when we went with the farmers. Someone asked us why we named ourselves Vetiver, and that always is my favorite story because it is literally a metaphor for how each of us needs to think of ourselves. Because I come from, my early experience in life was in luxury branding in New York. So there was a little bit of a taste for making sure that something is branded well and it has an aspirational quality to it. But when I came back to India and I sort of started looking at different roles that Vetiver plays. Vetiver was always my favorite fragrance, and I kind of saw what it actually does for soil erosion control and what it did for natural cooling, in terms of, even being able to drink it as a drink during summers. These sheets made of vetiver grass that are woven, that we grew up with all across India, that we used to be, used as blinds. So this vetiver grass has so many purposes, and it actually has like a direct market linkage. It is sold as very, very expensive perfume, one of the most expensive. And I realized that, when we think of restoring ecosystems, which is always something that I was, completely dedicated to once I decided to shift my career, I thought of, finding a metaphor that really symbolizes both the beauty of it, whatever represents this kind of fragrance, beauty, and elegance, but it also represents some very solid, ecosystems restoration work. So that's why I'm always kind of going back to the beginning, which is, of the many, many, many ways in which we could have named ourselves, we thought of ourselves as a vetiver, as a grass, as this grass, which happens to be it's from India. It's a native grass from India. And really kind of going back and seeing that it is lost all around us. We don't see vetiver anymore. What would it take for us to regrow that? And what would it take in terms of a metaphor to create those ecosystems again that would hold us together convergently? Not in isolated ways. So it's something that, because I've worked in many fields in the US before, I worked in branding, I worked as a brand strategist, a designer, a filmmaker, and then finally a sustainability advisor, and working in clean tech and the carbon market. So there was this whole spectrum of experiences I had in the US move. So I wanted to bring all of that and sort of bring it into one place, and Vetiver seemed like the perfect platform to do that.
So before we go on and talk more about the work that you're doing with Vetiver, can you just speak a little bit about where that transition happened to actually come back to India from New York and to focus from branding into having sustainability at the core of your work?
So I've always, I mean, the key inspiration in when we were growing up is I grew up in Rajasthan. My mother is a dedicated social worker. And I was very much exposed to going into the fields with her, while on her field work, especially with rural women and children. So that was just part of the DNA. We were really exposed to that. Both my parents, had a connection with sort of the land in Rajasthan, and we were very exposed to the rural areas. Then when I got to the US and built a career in using communications. I was very interested in using communications to express oneself, and I started in advertising in the 90s. There was always this huge disconnect between the amount of material one needs to print and produce to attract people to the next set of fashion, right? So I worked at a company, this particularly hit strong when I worked at a company that was every season creating millions of square feet of plexiglass, or printed, vinyl sheets, billboards, shipping them for all across, not just the US, but all across India, sometimes the world, putting it on transport. And just this for one season. I mean, it's gone in 2 months. You see it on window cases, and you see all these great images, and all this production goes into it, and there's designers involved, and there's millions of dollars worth of shoots happening, and all of this translates into this material that has only the staying power of a couple of months, and that really bothered me. It used to bother me a lot, and in fact, I was very lucky at that time to meet with my mentor, Paul Hawken. He's an environmentalist in the US. And I remember in the early 2000s, I met him and he said, okay, let's work on this solution together. So, I remember sort of, I think it was Shaw Carpets, if I remember correctly, really working with actually it wasn't Shaw Carpets. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the company. We tried to work out whether there was a way to recycle that plexi, whether there was a way of doing take back and waste, circularity before this whole kind of wonderful word circular economy came into the picture. So I was always very much driven by wanting to eliminate waste, and was really a personal journey all along. So it wasn't, ultimately when I just had enough and I realized there is no way I could apply, I was heading actually my an agency called Aceline, and they were, wonderful. I love Prosper Aceline. He's the head of the company, but I saw these luxury goods being promoted, like ostrich skin bags and crocodile skin shoes, to malls, to these, I remember looking at data at one point for Dubai and for Hong Kong. And the data showed that fur coats in Dubai were selling incredibly well. And there was a huge demand. Or in Hong Kong, ostrich skin bags. And I was like, this whole idea that luxury now represents the access to natural resource damage. To such huge violence. It's all happening because of branding. We are pushing that narrative. We're pushing, consume more of this because you're going to be great. And I was like, I'm not applying my mind for this, and I have to stop immediately, because you can only do so much when you're within the industry. So I left. Then that's where I met Bashak. I moved to San Francisco for this sustainability graduate school, and then had a wonderful chance to work with Paul Hawken and Janine Benyes, and at a solar, like a third gen PV solar company that they'd started, and sort of really helped develop that and be part of the core team. And when I was in San Francisco, I also realized, as much as I love the US because it's really given me a lot in terms of teaching me so many things, I realized also that there is a little bit of a disconnect between like funds and large money that wants to make a huge difference, and the insights on the ground. Really, they base it all on, it's very easy to, I'm sorry to say this, but it's very easy to spin the human story element for people who've not been here in India. You can show a suffering farmer, and you can state the problems, and you can say we need this money, and you hope that that money goes to the right place, and you think that that'll create a solution. But we all know that sustainability, the issues are so incredibly complex that even if money ended up there, we need that right capacity, that right enabling environment on the ground to make sure to bridge that connect. And I really wanted to play that role on the ground, and not just in money. Actually, we haven't taken money, per se, from any funders or anything like abroad. But our work then tends to be about identifying where we see a problem, and where I see a huge problem. And of course, everyone's now talking about it, is behavior change across various things, right? So we need to change the behavior. When you talk about changing behavior, you talk about systems change, you talk about thought change, and so you get to work on so many different things at the same time. So you have to work at the policy level, at the institutional level. You have to work with tools of design, which I had collected, in my past work, and you really just apply, everything you can, your strategic mind, to developing a model that can, as coherently as possible, offer a way of moving forward. I honestly am a very big pessimist, I will say, because things have gotten much worse. As we all know, the data says things are much worse. So I would not laud my efforts or anybody else's, Morag, because the work that lies ahead of us is so incredibly huge, and the time is so little now that I just feel that we all have to work exactly in this manner and find ways to scale it up. So I'm always kind of waking up literally every day with this thought: we've got very little time left. We can't spend time in BS.
Yeah.
And we've got to get this work going.
Yeah, because it is easy to kind of, like you're saying, to congratulate the work that's happening, which is so important, and it's setting sort of a new direction, new narratives, all of that. But the fact remains that the scale that we need to do this work is so much more vast than what is happening right now. So maybe you could sort of talk us through a little bit about how you're managing to scale that up. What are the strategies that you're using to ripple this? Maybe describe how far the work's going and who you're working with, and then what are those levers to make that happen? Because I know everyone's kind of sitting on the edge of their seat saying, so now, well, tell us how do we do this? How does it happen?
Well, I mean, I'm discovering it for myself, so I can't claim to say that I'm making it happen, but I can definitely share some examples of the work that we try and connect. An example is a project that we are doing on waste management in East Delhi, which is a very densely populated area, and huge problems with the landfill. As I said, one of the largest landfills in Asia is Ghazipur, is right at the edge of East Delhi. So how do you solve a problem like behavior change in a dense community where there's low-income populations who, there are many, many socioeconomic factors that are not going to connect them to the idea of, making my neighborhood better. So this is a project with the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India's office, and I must really credit them and their scientists. I work with someone named Dr. Chhaya Gupta, and the vision to know that you're a scientist and that you can bring in large machines to possibly like trommels, and that separate the waste and they make them into nice little, bundles and send them off for RDF. But they had the vision to say, no, we need a community-centric approach. We do need some behavior change alongside. Otherwise, no matter what science we bring in, it's actually not going to last. That's where we came in. We were brought in as that partner. And although much of our work has happened during the pandemic, because this is 3 year long, we started this 3 years ago, we were able to create a 360 model. We mapped it out and we said, okay, we need to, of course, collect data. We need to understand what's happening door to door, but we also need to engage these communities at a level that they understand. There are many ways. Firstly, there is social capital that's missing in this community, right? How do you build that social capital? you connect people to each other. How do you connect people to each other? You give them that kind of incentives to perform, to come out there, to be able to show their commitment to something greater, something other than what they're used to every single day. And and of course you work with women. So these are things that we went in knowing and planning that we are going to have this 360 approach, which is first going to start with this piece of research. Those insights, those behavioral insights are going to tell us, where the pivots can happen. When we know where the pivots can happen, what are the tools that you require? There are some design tools, there's some policy tools, there's some institution tools you will require to do that. You're going to require the implementation. Who's going to implement, who will these communities listen to? Will they own this model? You're going to need pilots, you're going to set up these pilots, and that's going to be a feedback mechanism. You come back into this, you're going to collect the data, you understand how that's happening, you iterate it again, and then you kind of like come back to it, right? So you develop this model, and that's how we approach everything. I like to, because that is how a problem has to be approached. But that problem in the sustainability space is everyone works in these silos. So you're only working on one part. And then, by the time the two of you talk, we've lost time. So in this project, we've been working, we started working, in a very, very participatory way. We didn't even name the project until the communities were fully on board with us, and they named the project in some ways. We made sure to keep going on and engaging them in FGDs and just sitting there, and saying, okay, this is the vision. This is what we hope to achieve. We're going to clean our canals. The canal leads to the Yamuna River. It's only one of the many canals that leads into the Yamuna River, but just the one canal represents lakhs of people. So let's try and change, the mindset that gets you to throw things into this canal, right? So that's where we started. Is it a problem for you? Do you feel it needs to change? Even when you don't see, whether this is a problem for you, what are your other problems? So it turns out, for example, that their machines, because of the methane, because of the gas emissions from the canal, the refrigerators and their ACs don't perform as long, right? They perform for a year before they need heavy servicing again. Mm-hmm. So they've been able to connect, the gas, the emissions from there to the machine. So you hear this out. You're reading between the lines to making correlations that they may not have made or have made, and then you try and work at a solution that they can really feel they want to do. It's not something you tell them to do. It's not a top-down thing. You say, would you like to do this? Let's solve it together. So you don't come in so forcefully, but you definitely come in very, very consistently, and you come in with a strong sense of caring and commitment. I'm with you. We're going to solve this. What do you think we should do? So we've worked on this process, and I'm very happy to say that in what was perceived to be a pretty hostile environment, and people, like I said, like a total lack of social capital there, we've connected hundreds of women. We started by showing them the advantages of making compost at home. Now, these are tiny balconies. Some of them don't even have balconies. Some of them have roofs, but not all of them have roofs. So certainly we're not working with 100% of the people, but the ones that can, when people realize that you can make compost at home, it's such a simple thing. We made a little video and like 17,000 women saw it. It's just, we've got these views and we didn't even expect it. You would think people just know how to make compost. So we led them through that process, and women are so excited in our WhatsApp groups. They keep sharing, what the quality of the compost is, and they immediately connected it to the idea of growing plants and small, urban gardens. So they've created these, some of them have actually made investments in creating these little sweet kitchen gardens on top of their roofs, from the khad is the word for compost, from the khad that they make themselves. The next thing we did was we started mapping institutions where the waste was coming out. So temples, temples have, surprisingly, we didn't expect this, but we discovered it, that a small temple, for example, can have like 2 to 3 kilos of flowers that people are bringing in as an offering, but a large temple can have 100 kilos every day. You've got tons of flower waste. Now, there are companies that work with transferring flower waste into different objects, but not they're not so present that they can actually utilize this. So there's definitely a disconnect. The thing about the sustainability space is there are solutions. It's not as if like we are inventors of a solution, and there are problems, but there aren't enough people to map the problem in a volume enough and do the work that's required to connect it to the solution, right? And that's just boring work in some ways for some people. It's not glamorous enough. It doesn't get you like invited to conferences to speak about. So a lot of people don't do it. So we kind of started working on connecting that thing together. So at a temple, we convinced the temple, and this was a huge, long process, to help us, to let us put biodigester drums on the premises, convincing them that it wouldn't smell, it would be this sacred flowers could be converted into, a beautiful sort of rich quality compost that women can take away for free. It would be managed by the community members. If we created this whole name Swachhata Sevadar, which is the idea of being someone who offers their gift of labor for cleanliness, right? This concept. So we got women to start doing this, and it became, the women really were into it. And then that evolved into, let's convert the flowers into holy, the colors that we play at Holy Festival. So women started this entrepreneurial program, and they themselves really took off on that. We provided the training to them, started selling the gulal, and it became really well, to the point that women formed groups and they were like competing on who's going to sell the most, etc. So
what was that you made? Sorry, I didn't quite catch what they made.
We made flowers, like flower powder for Holi. The festival, do you know the festival of Holi? Where you play with colors?
Yes,
so,
right.
Drying the flowers, crushing them. So these are now, organic colors. You don't need to buy the synthetic ones, and women are so proud of that. And they started making, other stuff with it, color. They're boiling the flowers and making the color that can be used for dyeing. All of this sort of innovation or thinking creatively happened by the communities themselves. We were just, there to kind of point out the solutions and work with them on the processes that happened, right? So what was the great discovery is, once you point a little part of the solution to the communities, as you know, Morag, you work a lot in this space, they embrace it. So we've had great success at the decentralized waste management level, in which we are at a household level as well as at a institutional level. We've started putting in these pilot units just to demonstrate that it is possible to not have to send all this waste to a landfill. There is a pretty robust value chain in India of, at the municipal level, of rickshawalas who pick up the waste and they kind of segregate the valued items and then they take it for themselves. But problem is that they don't see value in organic waste, certainly. And even within that other categories of waste, they really only pick the most valuable ones that they can sell right away. So there's a lot of work to be done, which we are working on. So now our next thing here is that we've got people to adopt. So we first said, do it at your own house, volunteer at a temple. Now we're like, okay, adopt your street. So we've launched this new program with the municipal council to adopt a street, in which we have mapped out literally every single step along the way and put in incentives for people to collect, segregate, be part of that system, so that we can actually, where women want. And now women, just yesterday I got a woman who said, I want to set up my own plastic collection system because I have a little space in that area. Great, let's make entrepreneurs of this. So this is an example. I mean, we've of course used a lot of awareness tools and wall paintings and animations and newsletters and all kinds of design tools.
Maybe just tease that out a bit. What are some of those communication tools that you use to bring this awareness into a community like that? So you mentioned wall paintings.
First is something called Nukkar Natak, which is a very common street plays in India. We wrote a street play on the importance of, on all of these issues, and made it really entertaining, and worked with a great group of maybe 25 performers who came in, and I can share pictures later, but who came in and walked through the streets, kind of in this very loud singing voice, chorus, of not doing it. So that piqued people's interest. And when we started going in, that was the first point of interaction, go in and you do that, get people to take a message and you know that it's happening at a community level. It's not just being told to them, it's told to everyone. So people feel a sense of cohesion around that. So that followed by, those people that did have WhatsApp, connect them on that and kind of begin to converse with them through messaging. But we did a mural on a temple. Outside a temple, we convinced this temple to at a very strategic place where you can see when you drive in, what the message is. We created a newsletter in which we featured the work of the women that was happening. And this newsletter is a community-owned newsletter where we would just feature all the work that people are doing and distribute it, and they would feel so proud that, they were part of it. We did many competitions, like painting competitions, slogan competitions, etc., with a small prize at the end for them to actually come in and be able to participate. Kids to participate as well. We've done showcasing. We've then worked with women to have their own performance plays. So women have together written songs and performed them, and they're so now, as I told you yesterday, they're willing to perform in the streets as well. Now these are women that come from not very liberal homes, for example. I mean, the women aren't really. Some women weren't even allowed to step out of their homes until this project came along, and now they're so excited that they have this thing that they can do as a purpose. So they are coming together to want to perform even in the streets. So that's a very exciting step for us. What works here is experiential stuff. Visual stuff works as a way to push something forward, but primarily it's experiential interaction. You go there, you perform, you sing, you are there as a community, and then you follow up with a nice little message. During the pandemic, we did a lot of Zoom calls with the women, and surprisingly, all of them figured it out. And we did, online training workshops. We invited experts to talk about their processes. So a lot of just constant feedback about the fact that there's a lot of change agents around, and there are processes that they can adopt.
Oh, sounds amazing. There's so many lessons in that I can hear, people thinking, oh my gosh, that would make such a difference in so many different places. I wanted to maybe ask you a bit about the work that you're doing around organic farming.
Sure, absolutely. So we're working on a project on behavior change for farmers, and the idea, we're working as a partner to SIF, and the idea here is to get farmers who are conventional practicing farmers who are using different kinds of fertilizers, weedicides, fungicides, pesticides, etc., to transition away to bio inputs that they can make themselves, and they can see the value of that, because you see incomes are they're deriving less and less yields. They're putting in more and more money into these inputs, chemical inputs, and of course land degradation is a huge problem. And so
what is the big picture of where agriculture is at in India these days?
Okay, so on one side, I mean, most farmers are most smallholder farmers are still protected in some ways because they can't. Some of them can't afford any expensive chemicals, but a lot of them, the chemical companies, the agro companies, so to say, are the key touch point for information for farmers. So when they are told they need to use a certain input to reduce a certain issue on the farm, they use it. So a lot of farmers are waking up to the fact that they've been lied to in some ways, because they can see the quality of the farm, they can see the quality of the soil, etc. But because of the small farm holdings, a smallholder farmer is extremely vulnerable. So to convince such a smallholder farmer to transition away into this is a challenge. It's a challenge because they're going to run to their local supplier to say, here's what I'd like to use. So large agri, I don't know what context, agriculture is, plagued by the same issues that a lot of the world is. You've got water scarcity, you've got climate change, rainfall variability, heat, all of which is affecting these crop cycles. And there is a major push in the government to move towards climate resilient crops and to look at, moving away from carbon and water intensive crops, and, really trying to create rich soil. Soil and water conservation programs have really been priority. And so people are working on that. There are certainly huge vulnerabilities. There's a massive work that needs to be done on climate change adaptation for farmers. There are so many changes that are coming down the pipeline across the board that, everything from livelihood options to more resilient agriculture, to more access to nutritional food. There are all kinds of things that are connected to the agri cycle that we're working on right now.
So there's something about the way that you do the work that you do through communication, like the design of the communications that you share out. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about what constructs a really good way to share a message to cultivate this behavioural change that you're doing. So as well as this ongoing on the ground, but in the materials that you create and maybe to reach. So you talked about how you reach into the community. How do you do the same type of thing to reach convincing a change at a higher level, perhaps in government or policy or business? Where are the levers there?
So policymakers don't have any time, as we all know, and you have to distill a message to them in the most succinct way possible in order for them to have the bandwidth to register what you're saying. That's where visual tools are extremely handy. This is the work that we've done for many years, tried to translate climate change, heavy documents into like a 5-minute animation or a e-learning module, where you can take people through the steps of climate financing, or you make a really attractive, visually interesting, with data visualization, a policy brief that they can read, position articles, etc. So there is a combination of visual tools that are used. And the key thing here is the domain. You see, sometimes design agencies don't quite understand the complexity of the nodes that are connected in order for a policymaker to really contemplate on a potential new direction. Because policymakers are very, very smart. They understand the entire breadth, but they don't have the time to think about how each of these is connected and which one is a priority. So you've got to do your work. And if you're a design agency that is working with a researcher, you've got to go back and forth a lot to make sure that firstly, you distill the right message in the right direction. Even sometimes, research recommendations are too overarching. Even though they're meant for policymaker and there's an executive summary, those two are a little too overwhelming. So figuring out how to visualize this and play with that a lot and look at it. So we're just working on an animation on peri-urban, on the importance of peri-urban agriculture for policy. So this is an animation for policymakers to let them understand, what it is that should be done within the space of peri-urban agriculture. That's based on a study by a research institute. So we have spent, this is a lot of work. It's about 3 months of tinkering at ways to approach it visually. And then once you approach it visually, you wonder whether you need to make it really, really like vernacular. Do you need to introduce elements that will take into account local motifs? Sometimes we do that, sometimes we don't. When it's an overarching thing, we don't put so much effort in that. But for example, we did a campaign called Forests Are Life with a ministry. And in that, every community where the campaign was going to go, we looked at the folk art, then we imbibed those motifs in there, and we made it into that language and kind of broadcast it that way so that it was very, very context specific. One of the problems with communication design in general is that while it tries to solve the huge problem, it tries to do it in a kind of a one-off approach. It creates one concept and then it pushes it to everybody, assuming that everyone relates to it in the same way. And I think, it's very, very hard work to try and break that down into context-specific information and to not necessarily have this cookie-cutter visual idea that you think will appeal to everyone, but hopefully in a more participatory way. But of course, that takes more time, and time is an issue. So we try and work, our team works really hard to try and counter that issue. But that is the ideal world. The ideal world is your policymaker should receive something. If they're a state-based policymaker, if they could see something, they could broadcast and share with maybe their own departments, and those departments felt that we or whoever was communicating really understood their nuance, and they could relate to that content, and it's short enough, and it's interconnected enough, you're going to be able to just at least be at the beginning of a mindset change. Of course, you'll have to interact with them a little bit more to convince them, but that piece of information, if it's done right, it can really make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's hugely powerful. I'm excited to hear you talking about the peri-urban agriculture issue, because that's a huge issue everywhere around the world. Yes. And I'm just wondering whether there's, and from my permaculture background too, I just wanted to ask you, like, where does that sit within the context that you're in, like the sort of the small scale, polycultural, community-based type of food systems? Is permaculture something that is known of there, is seen as a valuable tool? Tell me a bit more about that if you can.
Yes, I have. There is a very dedicated movement towards permaculture. You don't hear about it as much in your ongoing sustainability world, but there are sometimes you get invited to workshops on permaculture, and it isn't. I mean, I would say that there is a lot of room to talk about permaculture here and to really push that further. But certainly people know about it and people think of it as, of course, a very good approach. So Morag, I think, if at all you can extend the kind of work you're doing here in terms of training, engaging community on these aspects, I think there's a lot of room to do in India. At the policy level, certainly, there are a lot of sustainable agriculture goals that the government has, and there is a lot of action planning associated with that, and biomass, turning biomass into good soil input is very much part of the agenda. There's, I think, the capacity and the knowledge on that could be extended. Of course, there's traditional knowledge that already exists that needs to do that, but we've delinked from that traditional knowledge. So certainly even coming back to that and repackaging that information in a way that equates the value of permaculture to the data, to the kind of fertility that's associated with it, I think would really be. Would be important.
I kind of feel like someone like you needs to be at the core of this, because there's permaculture, there's the traditional way of thinking, there's the policy thing, and it's the communication of how something like permaculture can be of value and build on what people already know, and also link to the directions that your country is going, but also globally we need to go from the regenerative perspective.
Yes, very much. Very much. We need to connect. It's again about connecting the dots from, Morag, it's about identifying places that have that biomass input, figuring out the transportation logistics and bringing it back to the soil, because there are so many areas that are so heavily degraded that are far from places where they have that kind of biomass input. So the logistics, it's not just about doing that work, it's about figuring out where the raw material comes from and then being able to sustain that on the ground, So, India has a land degradation neutrality goal. And I think that, looking at whether permaculture can be done at scale or not, because I know it requires a lot of heavy biomass input, how do you connect what may be an existing material? I mean, I always kind of obsess about all this household waste that is ending up in landfills, that's creating methane and all kinds of other issues. Could we not just put that, make compost, put that in trains, like have it stop in the middle of nowhere, dump it, have it, all kinds of like utopian ideas, because there has to be something radical that has to be done. You've got all this rich input that's coming out of the households. We need like a composting revolution so that this can become the soil, they call it, it can kind of add layers of soil fertility again and then you can do leaves and all that other stuff.
I love that idea. I mean, I think you're absolutely right too. It requires this shifting out of our thinking about sort of tinkering around at the household level or even just at, a local level, which is where you get the shift, the connection happening. But then once we've got that, we need to be, revolutionizing our way of thinking. And so just as a final thought, like the trains of compost, I think that's absolutely brilliant. I think that is so brilliant. What are some of the other sort of big, like if you could change something and you think that, this would make a huge difference, what's your dream? What do you dream of shifting in to make a difference in the world? Because like I said, it's urgent, it's huge.
It sounds ridiculous. I mean, I really think it's household waste. I mean, it really starts there. For me, it starts with household waste because our consumption is destroying ecosystems, both in terms of what we take and what we put out. If we stop there, if we can just work on that solution truly, and we can figure out how to not have those two separated, our organic in this, and then lead it to the restoration of ecosystems, that's huge. And of course, I also obsess about the kind of stuff we are putting in our water. So water, removing damage into the water, literally sweeping solutions that are, I don't know if policy can do anything about it, but every time somebody uses a shampoo, like I try not to use, I'm sure you are, like we are all environmentally oriented, so we make choices that don't damage the water, right? But then there's all kinds of toxins that we put in the water anyways on a daily basis, cleaning our dishes and all kinds of things. Like if we could just stop at the household level, we could enact the large scale change. Because whenever I go to East Delhi and I put together the data, it's just a collection of 100 households amount to tons and tons of waste. And the kind of, if you work out all the different emissions and everything that's associated with it, that if that could be solved, the rest of the stuff could actually be.
Yeah, there's something about what you just said that is so hopeful, because it's not a massive, great thing to do, is it? It's not some kind of impossible technological challenge that we face. It is simply,
super decentralized.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you've got to duck off and get on with the things that you've got to do today. I'm going to share down below any links that you have to the work that you do. So please share those and we'll make sure that goes out there. Thank you so much, Chhaya. And I'm looking forward to continuing conversations around connecting in with the work that you do. And I know that one of the connections too that we had on the meeting the other day was around Ladakh. And that was a place that you mentioned that was a huge inspiration for you, as it was for me. I think that was the turning point in my life for doing the work that I do. One day I'd like to bring my family over there and share that with them. Yeah. Just as a final comment, sorry, what was it about Ladakh that
Actually, when I quit my job in New York, I did a bicycle ride from Ladakh to Manali, which is through the Himalayas, because I felt that would be my sort of the beginning of my connection with India, and I wanted to start at the top. I wanted to kind of really reconnect with my country. So I feel that not Ladakh, of course, there's so much soulfulness in the landscape and the incredible transition you go through from Ladakh when you come into Manali. There's this huge sudden burst of green and all kinds of vulnerabilities that are associated in the Himalayan system. Now water is such a huge issue all around there, that I just feel, the Himalayan range represents the biggest wisdom we have as a civilization, in the Indian civilization, because there's so much. A lot of that wisdom is associated with rich Himalayan, cultural and ecological systems. So, looking at that as a teacher and seeing where the teachings are, of course, in India, it's so rich, and there's almost a race against time to learn from indigenous cultures. And so many people are still wonderfully preserving things, but the onslaught of pressure is so high. We need to just, that's why I was saying last time that we need to be humble in terms of designers, because that is my biggest pet peeve with the design community. Or when I say design community, someone who thinks that they can make a change through the design of ideas, right? Is to think that they have a solution and to not learn from what somebody has, and not put in the time that you require to learn and work in a participatory way. That is the most important thing. Our systems are designed in such a way that we give awards, or we have someone's portrait, that's like suddenly on the cover of a magazine, and suddenly you feel you've arrived and whatever. We have such low benchmarks, as far as I'm concerned, for giving people accolades and for making people feel rewarded, that people start to sort of run in that space thinking that that is what they're working towards. Because in their mind, a lot of, I'm not saying all, of course, there's no incredible people that do the reverse, but the motivations in the industry are, to create the most glamorous, most award-winning campaign, but that doesn't necessarily translate into change. Mm-hmm. We've got to understand what change is, where it'll happen, and that requires anonymity. It really requires you to de-link yourself from what people might know about you and just literally tinkering. So that's what I would like to say at the end. If we are talking to a community of change makers, the real change makers don't care about any of this, but a lot of the people who want to transition into change making, and they are already in their fields, must do so without wanting to be now known as a catalyst of change and the change agent of the year, or most meaningful career of the year, whatever. None of this matters.
No, you become in service to the
out there.
Yeah,
and that's what indigenous cultures in Australia here, all of them teach us. There's wisdom in the collective, there's wisdom in anonymity. Nobody needs to own any ideas. You just do it for the greater good. Just do it. So yeah.
Thank you. That's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much again for your time, Chhaya.
Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show.
I look forward to having you speak to our communities as well. We'll arrange that very soon.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining me. If you like a copy of my top 10 books to read, click the link below, pop in your email, and I'll send it straight to you. You can also watch this interview over on my YouTube channel. I'll put the link below as well. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and if you've enjoyed it, please consider giving me a star rating. Believe it or not, the more people do this, the more podcast bots will discover this little podcast. So thanks again, and I'll see you again next week.